Wars, fought between 1803 and 1815, reshaped the map of Europe and sowed the seeds of modern political and social revolutions. But how did one man, an artillery officer from Corsica, rise to dominate an entire continent, and what led to his eventual downfall? We are Fortified History, and today we'll unpack the key events, battles and personalities of this dramatic era, and try to understand the legacy of Napoleon and the wars that bear his name. To understand the Napoleonic Wars, we first need to understand the man who gave them their name. Napoleon Bonaparte wasn't born into royalty or high society. He was born in 1769 on the small Mediterranean island of Corsica, just a year after France had taken control of it from Genoa. His family was minor nobility, but far from wealthy. In the chaos of the French Revolution, Napoleon saw his chance to rise. The revolution, which began in 1789, shattered the old order in France, and opportunities opened for people from all walks of life. Napoleon's brilliance as a military strategist quickly set him apart. His role in the siege of Toulon in 1793, where his innovative artillery tactics helped secure a Republican victory, was the beginning of his meteoric ascent. By 1799, Napoleon had become a general and was a popular hero in France. Sensing the instability of post-revolutionary government, he staged a coup d'etat. By the following year, had established himself as first consul, effectively the ruler of France.
But Napoleon wasn't content with merely being a revolutionary leader. In 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French in a grand ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, solidifying his personal power and signalling that he aimed to rebuild an empire that would stretch far beyond France's borders. The first phase of what we now call the Napoleonic Wars had already begun. Though France was at war with much of Europe from 1792 onward, it wasn't until 1803 that these wars became explicitly tied to Napoleon's imperial ambitions. By this point, France had already become a dominant military power, and Napoleon had reformed the army into one of the most formidable fighting forces Europe had ever seen. But who were his enemies? Primarily, it was the European monarchies that feared the spread of revolutionary ideas and French domination. Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and several other European powers would all form various coalitions to try and contain Napoleon's ambitions. The Napoleonic Wars were essentially a series of conflicts between France and all these shifting alliances. Napoleon's early campaigns were stunningly successful. He defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Ulm in 1805, and later that year at the Battle of Austerlitz, often considered his greatest victory, where he crushed the combined armies of Austria and Russia. Napoleon had demonstrated that his military genius was not just in tactics, but in mobility. He could outmaneuver his enemies and strike decisively.
But Napoleon's ambitions weren't just military. He wanted to reshape Europe, not just in a French image, but in a way that would cripple his primary rival, Britain. In 1806 he established the Continental System, a blockade designed to cut Britain off from European trade. His goal was to economically strangle the British Empire, but this would prove to be one of his first major missteps. Not only was it impossible to enforce across all of Europe, but it also antagonised nations that had once been neutral or supportive. One country where the effects of Napoleon's policies would be felt deeply was Spain. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain and Portugal, hoping to enforce the continental system and establish his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as king. But the invasion sparked a brutal and protracted guerrilla war known as the Peninsula War. This conflict, often referred to as Napoleon's Spanish Ulcer, drained French resources and manpower, and it gave Britain a foothold on the continent from which they could challenge French dominance. In Spain, Napoleon faced not only armies but a civilian population that resisted fiercely. It was a war unlike any he had fought before, and it marked the beginning of the decline of the French Empire. But if the Peninsula War was a slow bleed, the invasion of Russia in 1812 would be the fatal blow to Napoleon's empire. By this point, relations between France and Russia had deteriorated, and Napoleon decided that a swift military victory would bring Tsar Alexander I to heel.
What followed is one of the most disastrous military campaigns in history. Napoleon's Grand Armée, numbering over 600,000 men, marched deep into the Russian territory, but instead of facing a decisive battle, they encountered scorched earth. The Russians retreated and burned their cities, leaving nothing for the French to live off. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow, the city had been abandoned and set ablaze. With winter setting in and his supplies line stretched, Napoleon was forced to retreat. The Russian winter and the constant air attacks from Russian forces decimated his army. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée returned to France, fewer than 100,000 soldiers remained. This catastrophic defeat emboldened Napoleon's enemies. In 1813, a coalition of Austria, Russia, Prussia and Sweden defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations. By 1814, the coalition forces had invaded France and Napoleon was forced to abdicate. He was exiled to the island of Elba, but the story doesn't end there. In March 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to France. His dramatic return, known as the 100 Days, saw him rally the French people and once again take control of the government. But Europe's monarchies weren't going to tolerate this resurgence. The 7th Coalition, led by Britain and Prussia, quickly mobilised to stop him. The final decisive battle took place on June 18, 1815, at Waterloo. Napoleon's forces clashed with the Duke of Wellington's British troops and a Prussian army led by Gerhard Blücher. Despite his tactical genius, Napoleon's forces were outmatched and outnumbered. The Battle of Waterloo ended in a crushing defeat for Napoleon.
This time the European powers weren't taking any chances. Napoleon was exiled once more, but this time to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would spend the remaining 6 years of his life. The Napoleonic Wars forever changed Europe. The old monarchies were restored, but the seeds of revolution, nationalism and liberalism had been sown. The wars led to the redrawing of the map of Europe at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, an event that aimed to prevent another figure like Napoleon from ever rising again. But the wars also inspired sweeping military, legal and cultural changes. The Napoleonic Code, which codified civil law, remains a foundational legal document in many countries today. Militarily, Napoleon's strategies and organisational methods would be studied and emulated by future generations. And what of Napoleon himself? A tyrant, a revolutionary, a military genius? He was perhaps all of these things and more. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Napoleonic Wars. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to join us on Sundays at 4 p.m. as we look at another epic chapter of the past.